Alright, this is a reaction video to Oversimplified Adolf Hitler Part 1 and Part 2. The goal of this video is to introduce this topic of Adolf Hitler and how someone like Hitler, with all the negative characteristics that we attribute to him today, was able to assume power in a modern industrial state during the 20th century, a time where you would think people know better, a time of liberal democracies. How was someone like Hitler able to create this very intolerant totalitarian regime, implement his version of fascism in Germany, and lead the world into the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War? Why were contemporaries not able to stop him? Why did people in Germany let him get power? What were the circumstances that led to someone like Hitler becoming so important, so popular, and so influential? And the fact that people were not able or willing to prevent him from starting World War II until it was too late. So that's the goal of this video. So if you're learning about this in school or learning about this in university and you know very little about the topic, hopefully by going through this oversimplified video on Hitler and elaborating here and there, I'm able to provide you with a better understanding. That's the goal. But before we begin going through Oversimplified's video, I just want to speak about or answer a couple of questions about Hitler just to introduce this topic so you know what to look out for as the video progresses. So the question is, who was Adolf Hitler? Now, Adolf Hitler is regarded by most people as one of the, if not the most evil individual in human history. Why is this the case? Now, obviously, his actions are largely responsible, and some people will say directly responsible, for the outbreak of the deadliest war in human history, which is the Second World War, where over 60 million people died. Additionally, his actions are directly responsible. He targeted a specific group of people by virtue of being Jewish for extermination, and he's responsible for the death of over 6 million Jews. Not just Jews, there was also other people who he perceived as, whether it was gypsies or homosexuals, also targets for the concentration camps. Now, there are other people in human history, whether it's Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Leopold II of Belgium, who colonized the Congo, who are responsible for more than 6 million deaths. But with Hitler, we have a lot of photographs, images, and even video footage of the atrocities that were committed to the Jews. So there's a very powerful visual impact that we associate with Hitler. So when we think of racism, totalitarianism, the deadliest war in human history, we see Adolf Hitler and the symbol of hatred that he kind of created with Nazi Germany. So it's very easy to portray him as one of the, if not the most evil individual who's ever lived. But why was someone so evil with such huge defects as an individual able to lead a country as modern and as industrial and as powerful as Germany during a period as recently as the 20th century? So to answer that question, we need to look at what was Germany like when Hitler came to power. And to understand what Germany was like when Hitler came to power, it's important to look at what happened to Germany during the First World War. The First World War, Germany before the First World War, it was established in 1871, the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. So Prussia, a big German-speaking country, defeated France and merged with other German-speaking countries. And you can think of like overnight, this new country is established and becomes the most powerful country in Europe. Very, very powerful, very industrial. German people assert their nationalism, feeling very, very proud. But World War I is going to have a devastating impact on that Germany. Now, Hitler was born in 1889 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was German. And when the First World War broke out, well, just before the First World War broke out in 1913, he was conscripted to the Austro-Hungarian Empire because of its multi-ethnicity, the various different peoples who lived there, different ethnicities, different languages. Hitler did not want to represent Austro-Hungary. So he fled across the border to Bavaria in southern Germany in 1913, and he was influenced by a lot of individuals who were promoting German nationalism or German ethnicity, and he wanted to represent the purity of the German race. So when the First World War broke out, he had no problem serving in the German army to represent Germany. The First World War turned out to be one of the happiest times for Hitler. It's ironic because for most people it was one of the worst times, especially those who were serving on the front lines. There was a great period of European history, and then suddenly you had the First World War, the horrendousness of living in a trench. It had a terrible psychological impact on many, but well, Hitler really enjoyed his experiences in the First World War. He was traveling from trench to trench, transporting messages. He won the Gold Cross, the first class, the Iron Cross, the first and second class. But when Hitler was in the war, he was wounded, returned back to Germany, came back to the war, and then he was blinded by poison gas. While he was in hospital, he heard that Germany had kind of surrendered, signed the armistice. And for people like Hitler who were on the front lines, you could not understand this because, from their perspective, Germany was in French territory on the verge of capturing Paris. It's not like France and Britain ever invaded Germany during the First World War. So, from their perspective, they were winning. Why did they surrender? Now, the broader perspective is because the United States was coming and getting involved in the war. The United States, which was untouched by the horrors of World War One. You can think of it as being a fresh, very powerful country, getting involved, joining Germany's enemies, Britain and France. The odds of Germany being able to fight back was impossible. It was only a matter of time before they lost. And the idea was the quicker they negotiate surrender, the better for them, because it just, why delay the inevitable? And the inevitable will be it's impossible for Germany to fight the United States, Britain, and France at the same time. But for people like Hitler, they cannot understand this. So there was kind of this idea that they were stabbed in the back. By who? Perhaps communists and perhaps Jews. The idea that Germany on the field was the most powerful army, but at home they were sellouts, traitors, November criminals. When the war ended, Germany was badly devastated. Now, the two leaders of Germany during the First World War, Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, they were two top generals. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor or Kaiser of Germany, voluntarily handed power to these two generals during the war. But as the war progressed and as the United States got involved, Ludendorff realized that it was a matter of time before Germany loses. So it was him that appealed to the United States to come up with an end to the war. Now, this is something that's often forgotten. When the generals handed over power they decided to hand over power to civilian government, and the civilian government would become known as the Weimar Republic. They chose the city of Weimar to become the home of this new government because Berlin would have been too chaotic at this point in time. There's communists, there's nationalists, there's right wing, there's left wing, there's people fighting on the street. It would be vulnerable for a coup d'etat or for violence. So they chose Weimar to be the new capital. The idea was that if Ludendorff and Hindenburg hand over power to a democratic civilian government, the peace treaty would be kinder to Germany. Woodrow Wilson, leader of Democratic United States of America, would be more willing to give a fair deal to Germany. That's unfortunately not what happened. When they met at the Paris Peace Conference, the Allies put very harsh conditions on this new Weimar government. Now, the delegates at the conference wrote back home to find out from the government before they signed this Treaty of Versailles, this very unjust document. And the Weimar government asked the generals, if we don't sign this document and we're forced to fight, we are forced to fight in another war, would you be able to defend us? And they say, no, we can't. And then reluctantly, the Weimar Republic signed the Treaty of Versailles because they had no option. But this is not the perspective of people like Hitler. People like Hitler felt that it was the Weimar government that was weak and signed this Treaty of Versailles. The German army was winning the war. After the war, Germany is plagued by very, very bad circumstances. Hitler is released from the army. He's employed before he's released from the army, before the Treaty of Versailles is announced and the German government has to reduce the army to 100,000, he is employed by the army to spy on politicians, political parties, workers' parties, to see if they're communist. And he joins the German Workers' Party. Well, he's spying on them, but very soon he realizes that their ideals are very similar, and he ends up leading this German Workers' Party, which will later change the name to Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, calls it socialist to attract workers. And he eventually starts to lead this Nationalist Socialist Party. Germany is plagued by inflation. Well, anyway, I'm talking too much now, so just emphasize just some of the most important issues. So, 1919 to 1923, Hitler gets involved in politics. He joins the German Workers' Party, changed the name to National Socialist German Worker Party, or um, Nazi Party for short. He's originally in charge of propaganda, but because of his charisma, his ability to speak very, very well and get supporters of the party, he eventually becomes the leader of the party. Now, in 1922, Benito Mussolini had his march on Rome, and Victor Emmanuel III made him prime minister in 1922. 1923, conditions are very bad in Germany. The Germans try to stop paying the French some of the money that they owe the French as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. France invades the Ruhr, tries to seize assets, seize possibly as much as £40 million worth of assets, not enough to compensate the amount of money that the Germans owe them. The Germans respond with passive resistance and striking, but this also affects the German economy. The German Weimar government prints out more money, which is introduced into the economy, leads to very, very bad inflation. At the end of 1923, Hitler attempts to do what Mussolini did in Rome, march on Berlin. It's known as the Beer Hall Putsch, but unlike Mussolini, who becomes prime minister, Hitler gets arrested. He's originally sentenced for 5 years imprisonment, but he ends up only serving 9 months. When he's released from prison, his popularity goes down. And the reason for this is because when Germany's economy is doing very badly, people like Hitler are very popular. But Germany recovers because of the Dawes Plan, where the United States is going to loan a lot of money to Germany, help reboot Germany's industry and economy. They will then be able to pay back Britain and France the money that they owe Britain and France as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, and Britain and France will be able to pay back the United States the money that it borrowed during the First World War. So now conditions are good in Germany from about 1924 or 1925 onwards until 1929, when you had the Wall Street stock market crash, which causes the Great Depression. Hits the United States very, very badly. They need, one, they have to stop loaning Germany money, and two, they need to demand the money that Britain and France owes them. Britain and France then put more pressure on Germany to pay back them the money, and Germany gets very, very badly affected. Unemployment reaches as high as 6 million. Hitler becomes popular again. And in 1931 and 1932, the Nazi Party its popularity starts to increase, eventually becomes the party in Germany with the second highest amount of votes. Due to a variety of factors we'll get to, Hindenburg decides to make Hitler chancellor in 1933. Shortly after, Parliament building burns down. A communist is blamed for this, and Hitler uses the opportunity to create a one-party state in Germany, announces himself as the Führer, gives himself 4 years where he can make laws irrespective or independently of Parliament, and then he'll just keep extending that to another 4 years. And then he will just break the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the German army, and initiate the sequence of events that will lead to the Second World War. Okay, so that in a nutshell is just the story of Hitler and how he came to power in Germany. Now we will start going through the video.
Look at this baby. So gentle. So innocent. You'd think this child would grow up to become a good man. An honest man. Well, think again. Hitler was born Adolphus Hitler in 1889 in a small town in Austria-Hungary. His father, Alois Schicklgruber, was born out of wedlock, but eventually changed his name to that of his stepfather, becoming Alois Hitler. Alois was a mid-level Austrian customs officer, not really rolling in cash, but certainly rolling in women. He married a rich, older lady, but then immediately started having affairs, including one with a much younger house servant. A few years
Okay, well, this quick story about Hitler's father, Alois Hitler, is interesting because, here they're going to talk about Hitler's birth, but Alois's birth is interesting. Now, he was the son of a 42-year-old peasant woman, Maria Schicklgruber, and she was working for a number of Jewish families. She left the name of Alois's father blank on his birth certificate. No one knows who Hitler's father's father is, Hitler's grandfather. And eventually, she married someone named Johann Georg Heidler. When they got married, the priest misspelled the name Johann. Well, he misspelled the surname as from Heidler to Hitler, which means one who's born in a hut. And Alois, his adopted son, accepts that name. Now, the point of this is just the simple fact that nobody actually knows who Alois's legitimate father is. Later on, when Hitler starts implementing his Holocaust and atrocities against the Jewish people, if you were a German citizen, to prove that you had no Jewish blood, you needed to prove that all four of your grandparents were Christian and not Jewish. Hitler cannot prove who his one grandparent is, his father's father. And hence, a lot of rumors came up that there was a Jewish person who his grandmother was working for, who might have been Hitler's father. So that conspiracy theory about Hitler having Jewish blood, one of his grandparents was Jewish, and by his own protection of the racist laws in Germany, he would have been classified as a Jew had he not been Adolf Hitler.
Years later, he left his sick wife to be with his mistress, but since the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce at the time, he couldn't marry her. So he waited for his old wife to die and had a child in the meantime. Then his wife died, so he married his mistress and had another child, but then his new wife got sick, so he employed his much younger cousin Clara to take care of her. Then when his new wife died, he immediately got Clara, his cousin, pregnant, and then married her. In that order, you rock star. Clara and Alois had 3 children together, who all tragically died while in infancy. So when the 4th child, Adolf, came along, Clara spoiled him rotten. The Hitlers had 2 more kids, and the family moved around a few times, meaning Adolf had to attend 5 different elementary schools. Adolf's father was strict, quick to anger, and took most of it out on the eldest son until he had enough and ran away at the age of 14, leaving 7-year-old Adolf to do most of the chores and get berated by his father. The result was a difficult relationship with
Okay, well, anyway, I'm talking too much now before we even start going through Oversimplified's video. But just long story short, Hitler, born in Austria, moves to Germany, represents Germany in World War One. World War One has a very negative impact on Germany, and in spite of Germany being one of the most powerful countries leading up to the First World War, the war kind of led to devastation. Immediately after the war, there were various attempts at revolutions, there were communist uprisings, there were right wing uprisings. The new democratic government that came to power, which tried to do the best that it can, was blamed for signing the Treaty of Versailles, was blamed for Germany surrendering in the First World War, even though it wasn't that government's fault. And people like Hitler viewed that government as being very weak. Immediately after the war, Hitler was appointed by the army to spy on workers' parties. He ended up joining one and leading it, the Nationalist Socialist Party. In 1923, he attempted a coup d'etat in Germany, similar to what Benito Mussolini had done in Rome. Hitler wanted to recreate that in Germany. In 1923, just after Mussolini's coup d'etat or march on Rome in 1922, there were a lot of very bad things that happened in Germany. There was rampant inflation, and what happened was Germany wanted to not pay France some of the money that the Treaty of Versailles said that they need to pay France for that year, because one of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was that Germany takes responsibility for the war and pays back the Allies about 6.6 billion pounds. Germany was unable to pay. The French occupied the Ruhr, which was led to a lot of resentment in Germany, a very rich industrial area. The French were not able to get the money out of the Ruhr. German workers went on protest. They followed passive resistance. The French managed to seize about 40 million pounds worth of assets, but it wasn't enough. And the fact that the Germans responded with passive resistance against the French, going on strike so that the French don't take the money from Germany that the Germans owe them, led to further devastation on the German economy. The Germans government introduced or printed more money. It led to very, very bad inflation, making the government look even worse. People's life savings were wiped out. Then Hitler attempted his Beerhoff Putsch, but unlike Benito Mussolini, where King Victor Emmanuel III made Mussolini prime minister, in Germany, Hitler was arrested. And it was kind of a failure. While Hitler was in prison, he was actually sentenced to 5 years prison. He ended up only serving 9 months. Could have been worse, but the judge, jury sympathized with Hitler. He said all the things that they wanted to hear. And when Hitler came out of prison, his popularity dwindled downward. And the reason for this was because the German economy began to recover. Charles Dawes of the United States, a former general, he was in charge of this conference where the Americans were trying to promote German economic recovery to help stabilize Europe. And the idea was that they were going to loan Germany a lot of money, which Germany would use to reboot their economy. The Germans introduced a new currency. And then the idea is that with this economic recovery, they'll be able to pay back Britain and France, who'll be able to pay back the Americans. And there was economic growth from about 1925 to 1929. When there's economic growth and prosperity in Germany, Hitler's popularity goes down. But 1929 Wall Street stock market crash led to the Great Depression, and this had a devastating impact. So first, the United States was badly affected, but the saying is when the United States catches a cold, when the United States sneezes, the whole world catches a cold, and this impact would be felt. The United States would need the money that Britain and France owed them, which they borrowed during the First World War. Britain and France would need back the money that Germany owes it as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany would be totally devastated. Unemployment reaches 6 million. Now that Germany is devastated, someone like Hitler becomes popular again. And now the Nazi Party is going to slowly start gaining more ground in elections. In 1931, 1932, there are a number of elections. The Nazi Party becomes the second largest party. I won't get into too much detail about how Hitler eventually gets power. We'll cover that as the video progresses. But Hindenburg eventually appoints Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, and the parliament building will burn down shortly thereafter. Hitler would use this to his advantage, pass the Enabling Act, which enables him to pass laws without consultation of parliament for the next 4 years. And he just keeps extending this and extending this. And he basically becomes the Führer of Germany. Hindenburg, who was the president, passes away. Hitler creates the Nazi state that we are familiar with and leads the world into the Second World War. So that, in a nutshell, is just the story of Hitler. Now we will start the video.
Look at this baby. So gentle, so innocent. You'd think this child would grow up to become a good man, an honest man. Well, think again. Hitler was born Adolphus Hitler in 1889 in a small town in Austria-Hungary. His father, Alois Schicklgruber, was born out of wedlock, but eventually changed his name to that of his stepfather, becoming Alois Hitler. Alois was a mid-level Austrian customs officer, not really rolling in cash, but certainly rolling in women. He married...
Okay, this section on Alois Hitler, Adolf Hitler's father, is not too important as far as the story of how Hitler became the dictator of Germany and how he led the world into the Second World War. But one point that is a bit interesting about Alois Hitler, just to elaborate on, because it will help clarify a lot of confusion that people have with Hitler, is that his mother was a 42-year-old peasant when she had him, and she left the name of his father blank on his birth certificate. So no one knows exactly who Alois Hitler's father is. So Adolf Hitler's grandfather, his father's father. The identity of that individual is unknown. She was working for a number of Jewish families. Later on, she got married to a guy named Johann Georg Heidler. And when the priest registered their marriage, he misspelled Heidler, the individual's surname, as Hitler, which means one who lives in a hut. But they decided to keep the name for Alois Hitler, and hence Alois Hitler would be Hitler's father. But why that story is significant is Hitler's grandfather is unknown. And later on, when Hitler came to power in Nazi Germany, in order to prove that you were of pure blood, you needed to prove that all four of your grandparents were not Jewish. They had to be Christian. So if you had one grandparent who was Jewish, or you could not prove the identity of that grandparent, you could be persecuted under the laws that the Nazis were passing to persecute against Jews. Hitler, by his own rules, would have been classified as Jewish had he not been Adolf Hitler. because he simply doesn't know the identity of his grandfather and hence cannot prove that his grandfather was not a Jew. And when Hitler rise to power, there was a bunch of conspiracy theories circulating about one of the individuals that Alois Hitler's mother worked for, Maria Anna Strickelgruber, Hitler's grandmother, was Jewish and could have been Alois's father, and hence Hitler's grandfather.
Married a rich older lady, but then immediately started having affairs, including one with a much younger house servant. A few years later, he left his sick wife to be with his mistress, but since the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce at the time, he couldn't marry her. So he waited for his old wife to die and had a child in the meantime. Then his wife died, so he married his mistress and had another child, but then his new wife got sick, so he employed his much younger cousin Clara to take care of her. Then when his new wife died, he immediately got Clara, his cousin, pregnant, and then married her. In that order, you rock star. Clara and Alois had 3 children together, who all tragically died while in infancy. So when the 4th child, Adolf, came along, Clara spoiled him rotten. The Hitlers had 2 more kids, and the family moved around a few times, meaning Adolf had to attend 5 different elementary schools. Adolf's father was strict, quick to anger, and took most of it out on the eldest son until he had enough and ran away at the age of 14, leaving 7-year-old Adolf to do most of the chores and get berated by his father. The result was a difficult relationship with his dad while he was super attached to his mother, who worried over him and his health excessively. Hitler did well in school at first. His grades were good and his teachers praised him. He was popular with the other kids and enjoyed gathering them together to play war games. He also loved reading and particularly liked stories about cowboys and Indians.
White guys take over everything. Name of the book.
As he grew older, though, he started to get into trouble. He was caught smoking once, organized a raid on a local orchard, tormented his pro-Austria religion teacher with symbolic gestures, displaying his allegiance to the idea of united Germanic people under a greater German state in defiance of Habsburg Austria. You know, the usual. All of this enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. The area of Austria-Hungary that Hitler lived in was once part of the German Confederation, and many of the people who lived there considered themselves to be German. Adolf tended to just go against whatever his father said, and since his father was an Austrian public official, Hitler got big into German nationalism. This enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. Around this time, a family tragedy struck. His 6-year-old brother, whom he loved a lot.
So when Hitler was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was extremely diverse, lots of different ethnicities, lots of different languages. Hitler considered himself German. He was influenced by a number of German playwrights, poets, etc., who spoke about the purity of the German race, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended up disgusting Hitler. Later, when he went to the capital, Vienna, this disgust will increase.
Died of measles when Adolf was 10 and was buried in the cemetery just across from their home. Around this time, neighbors reported a change in the young boy. Strange behaviors such as talking to trees and staying up late staring at the stars from the cemetery walls. He lost interest in religion and his school grades started to decline, which enraged his father, who punished him severely. It also didn't help that he had just entered high school and the cool city boys treated him like a rural peasant. He had to repeat a grade and had little interest in most school subjects, instead spending his time reading and drawing, which he was quite good at. One day his father said, "Son, someday you'll be a big balls public official like me." And Adolf replied, "No, father, I'm going to become an artist and soar high above the clouds with the eagles." This enraged his father, but by this time he was an old-ass man, so he just sort of let it go, and then died of a lung hemorrhage. Hitler just about passed his final semester and celebrated in the typical way, by getting blackout drunk and wiping his ass with the certificate. However, he didn't take the overall final school exam, instead just dropping out. The now 16-year-old boy was unemployed.
Just a picture here of Wagner, a composer that had a huge influence on Hitler in his attempts to promote German pride.
Without much purpose in life, and for the next 3 years, he stayed that way. He spent most of his time at the opera with his only friend, August Kubizek. Kubizek later wrote his memories of the young Hitler and said he was passionately interested in many things, felt he was in many ways better than others his age, was quick to anger just like his father, and an incredible speaker once he was ranting. When he was 18, he said a very sad goodbye to his mother and went to Vienna to take the entrance exam for art school. He failed. Soon after, he had to return home. His mother was sick and her health was rapidly deteriorating. Hitler stayed by her side, and when she eventually died, the family doctor said he had never seen someone so overwhelmed with grief as Hitler was. Then Hitler returned to Vienna, still hoping to find a career in the arts, but he never did. Instead, without parental support, Hitler ended up on the streets. Now in his early 20s, he spent a few rough years living in and out of homeless shelters, making what little he could from selling postcards he painted. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when and how Hitler's extreme ideological beliefs formed, but his time in Vienna would have certainly played a role. Anti-Semitism was widespread in the city. The mayor, whom Hitler supported, was an outspoken anti-Semite. There were many right-wing anti-Semitic newsletters, which Hitler took a keen interest in. He bought into the conspiracy theories and became a firm believer in the idea that there are many races in constant struggle with one another, the purest of which were the German Aryan people, and the worst of which, he believed, were Jews. Since Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire full of lesser races, Hitler wasn't a fan. So when he was 24, he moved to Munich in Germany.
Okay, so Adolf Hitler's growing up reasonably normal childhood. His father was very, very strict. His mother was overprotective of him because of the fact that two of his older siblings had passed away at birth. When in the year 1900, when Hitler was about 10 years old, his younger brother passed away, and this had a negative impact on Hitler. He wanted to be an artist. His father died. He traveled to Vienna in 1907, the same year his mother would die. Most people today say that Hitler was a competent artist, not the best. Either way, he wasn't accepted to Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts. Their entrance requirements were quite high. He attempted to apply twice, and he was rejected both times. He spent those years when he was in Vienna living on the streets. His father, who worked his whole life, was able to save up for his retirement. He died very young. Hitler inherited that money and he wasted it very quickly. And then Hitler spent time in Vienna living on the streets, and to support himself, he would paint postcards or watercolor paintings. And this was a miserable time for Adolf Hitler. In 1913, he was enlisted to join the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but given the fact that it's a multi-ethnic empire, he hated it and he fled across the border to Munich, Germany. And when 1914, when the First World War broke out, he would have no problem representing the German army or the Bavarian army, the southern part of Germany. Now, there is a bit of questions about how was a Austro-Hungarian citizen allowed to serve in the German army. Ideas maybe Hitler fabricated his documents, or maybe because of World War I, they wanted as many soldiers as they could have, so they overlooked the fact that he was from Austria-Hungary. Nonetheless, in 1914, when the First World War broke out, Hitler had no problems serving on the German army.
To avoid doing military service, and for one more year he was a drifter on the streets, until something huge happened. In 1914, long-standing tensions in Europe erupted into the First World War. Crowds across Europe celebrated the news. Within days, Hitler volunteered for the German army. The war gave him a purpose in life. His fellow soldiers gave him friendship and brotherhood. Despite the horrors of war, Hitler considered it to be the best time of his life. He was reportedly a brave soldier and was awarded the Iron Cross, first class. He was also very lucky and had many close encounters with death. His luck ran out in 1916, however, when an artillery shell injured his leg. He went back to Germany to recover and was outraged to find a general apathetic anti-war attitude among the exhausted and hungry German populace. With the war turning against Germany, he returned to the front lines, but was temporarily blinded by a British gas.
So Hitler's job in the First World War was to transport messages from trench to trench. This is obviously a time period where there's no WhatsApp or things where you can transport messages quickly. So it was his job to go through the different layers of German trenches. He was very, very brave. He was awarded the Iron Cross first and second class. Ironically, it was actually a Jewish senior that recommended him for the Iron Cross. He was promoted as far as corporal and not beyond that, because a lot of the superiors in the German army felt that he lacked leadership skills to be promoted beyond that. He did get wounded. He returned to Germany, came back to the war, and he's going to be blinded by poison gas. Also, during his time in the army, he also was different to most of the other soldiers. He wasn't very social, wasn't interested in most of the things that normal people are interested in. They called him the woman hater. They called him the White Crow because he was a bit reserved.
Gas attack in 1918. A month later, still recovering in hospital, Hitler learned of Germany's defeat and surrender. The terms of the peace treaty were tough on Germany. It had to pay a lot of money and lose a lot of soldiers. These conditions weakened Germany and humiliated the German people. Europe's borders changed after.
Okay, so during the war, Hitler's serving on the front lines. Unlike most people, Hitler's extremely excited about this. The First World War was some of the happiest times in his life. He was a failed artist. He was living in misery in the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the streets. Now he finally found his life's purpose, representing the German Empire, and he's very happy to do that. While he's on the front lines, from his perspective, the Germans are in France. They're on the verge of capturing Paris and winning the war. However, he's not aware of the bigger perspective. The bigger perspective is that even though Russia had recently dropped out of the war, the United States has come in, and the United States had been out of the war for very long. So while Europe was busy destroying itself, the United States was becoming richer and more powerful. When they get involved in the war on the side of Britain and France, it's impossible odds for Germany to win. Hitler's not aware, and most soldiers are not aware of the bigger picture, but they're just aware of the fact that they are in French territory. The French and the British had not invaded Germany. Hitler's in hospital, and then he finds out the news that Germany surrendered. And this is something that he just simply cannot understand. Likewise, the German soldiers who are in French territory would have to march back home to Germany on land that they had conquered. As they go through France, returning to Germany, it's very strange for them why they are the ones who had surrendered in this conflict.
After the war, too, new countries were formed out of Russia's lost territory. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and there was one big new country.
And to make matters worse, so it was actually Ludendorff who wanted to negotiate a peace settlement with the Americans. And the army would return home back to Germany. They would establish a new government. So Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg were the two German generals that were ruling Germany during the First World War. They realized that if they stay in control of Germany during the peace settlement, there might be resentment. The Allies would associate them with the German regime, and they were responsible for a lot of German victories. So to carry favor in the peace conference, they voluntarily hand over power to a civilian government, the Weimar Republic, as they'll be known as. They chose the German city of Weimar as opposed to Berlin, because Berlin would be very chaotic. All countries that partook in the First World War would have a lot of chaos back at home. There'd be communist revolutionaries, there'd be right-wing revolutionaries. So the idea was station this new government in Weimar as opposed to Berlin, where things are a bit quieter and the government will be able to get back to its work. The idea is if Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg give power to this Weimar government, the Weimar government is going to be a democratic government, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States leading the Paris peace talks, which would come up with the terms of the peace settlement, would be more compromising to Germany. And that's actually not what ended up happening. And instead, they got the Treaty of Versailles, which gave about 13% of Germany's land to other European countries, gave away all the overseas colonies to other European countries. And the Weimar Republic was forced to sign this document. Now, something that's overlooked is that they asked the generals. So the war is over. Germany withdrew its forces back to Germany. They sent delegates to Versailles, talk at the Paris Peace Conference, and then they find out they've been given a very unreasonable document to sign. They actually send a message back home to find out if they don't sign this document, will the army be able to defend Germany? And the generals say no, they cannot. And hence, reluctantly, the Weimar government has to sign the Treaty of Versailles. But for most Germans and for people like Hitler, they don't take that into consideration. They blame the Weimar government for signing this document, and they see the Weimar government as being very weak.
Splitting Germany into two. Hitler, seeing the country he loved humiliated like this, said that hatred grew in him for those responsible, by which he meant communists and Jews, who he believed had stabbed Germany in the back by spreading dissent and anti-war propaganda back home.
Okay, so that's part one, a lot of background information about Adolf Hitler. Part two is going to be where we really get into the important information as far as people who are looking for understanding how Hitler came to power in Germany and how he led the
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general, so he had attempted a revolution, and the government was
in 1919, the First World War is over. It ends in 1918. People return back home. The army has a kind of rehabilitation for former soldiers, and Hitler undertakes this rehabilitation to try and incorporate them back into civilian life. He's also employed by them for a short time to spy on workers' parties, which might be communist. So he goes to these meetings and he informs the army what's going on. In Germany at this point in time, so at the end of 1918, a new democratic government is established. 1919, they hold their first elections. Friedrich Ebert becomes of the Social Democrats, becomes the new government, but there's so much of chaos in Germany. There's 2 attempted revolutions in this period of time. A group of communists calling themselves the Spartacus try to take control of the government. The government relies heavily on former soldiers to put down that, but then these former soldiers try to take over the government. So there's a lot of chaos in this point in time.
Worried about communism in general, so Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
So Adolf Hitler was sent to this German Workers' Party to spy on it. He ends up joining it. Because of his public speaking abilities, they make him in charge of propaganda. But very soon, by about 1921, he becomes the leader of this party, and he changes the name to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, which is abbreviated to Nazi Party. And even though he's not a socialist and the party is not a socialist party, they choose the word socialist in their name to attract workers. So to make the party more popular, given the aftermath of the First World War and what conditions are like in Germany, they believe that if they have the word socialist in their name, it will help attract workers to the party.
Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time. The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, $1 US was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, $1 US was equal to 4.2 trillion marks.
Now, imagine if your life savings would be eliminated during this point in time. Because if you were saving, so in 1919, so $1 was worth 4.5 German marks. So if you had a whole lot of money that you spent your life saving in your bank account, the inflation renders that obsolete. Because if 1923, 4.2 billion marks, or trillion marks, sorry, is worth $1, then your whole life savings is now, way more than your whole life savings. It's now the equivalent of less than $1.
The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters,
In 1922, Benito Mussolini had his march on Rome. He threatened the government that if they don't make him prime minister, his fascist soldiers will take control of all government buildings. The prime minister wanted to make a deal with Mussolini. Mussolini refused. He said, either I become prime minister or else. The prime minister appealed to Victor Emmanuel III, the king of Italy, to do something about that, but not to do something, to send the army to crush Mussolini's fascist black shirts who were marching on Rome. But Victor Emmanuel III was worried about the potential of a civil war, so he appointed Mussolini as prime minister, and Mussolini came to power in 1922. So 1923, Germany has a very, very bad year. They can't pay France. The French occupy the Ruhr land. It's very humiliating for the Germans. Inflation reaches its worst. They overproduce money. People's life savings are wiped out. People need wheelbarrows just to go to a shop just to buy something like a loaf of bread. And in this situation, Hitler attempts to do what Mussolini did in Italy, and that is to seize control of the government.
he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was covered by...
So while he was in prison, he would speak to Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess would sit with the typewriter and compile these words of Hitler's into pages, and this manuscript will eventually manifest itself into the book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle,
the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany, but the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting.
Now, why Hitler's popularity went down? So in 1923, the Nazi Party was one of the leading right-wing political parties. But after Hitler went to prison, Germany's economy began to recover because of the Dawes Plan. Charles Dawes of the United States chaired a conference in which the Americans agreed to loan a lot of money to Germany, help reboot its economy. The idea is that if Germany reboots its industry and its economy, it will promote a general European recovery. They'll pay back the money they owe to Britain and France, and Britain and France will pay back the money that they owe to the United States. And for a short period of time, it was working. And when Germans started experiencing a bit more prosperity, better living conditions, Hitler's popularity dwindled, and hence he did very, very bad, only about 2.6% of the votes in the 1928 elections.
And how unpolitician-like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face
But now, the Great Depression, the Wall Street stock market crash initiates the Great Depression, which is felt worldwide. For a country like Italy, it made Mussolini popular because the agricultural Italy wasn't affected in the short term by the Great Depression. However, somewhere like Germany, very, very different. And unemployment reached over 6 million. Now there's going to be people being laid off from work, mass poverty, and a lot of anger. And that anger, Hitler will be able to use it to his advantage.
of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the
Now, he is going to try and form a coalition with Paul von Hindenburg. Now, the first time he has a meeting with Hindenburg, it doesn't go well. This is recently after Hitler's niece, so in 1931, Hitler's sister or half sister moves in with him. Hitler gets close to her daughter, his niece, and rumors start getting spread that they are having an affair. The two become extremely close, and Hitler becomes increasingly possessive. Eventually, she's found dead. She took his gun and she shot herself in the chest. There's a lot of rumors that Hitler might have been raping her. She once confided in a friend that you have no idea what a monster my uncle is. You have no idea what he makes me do. Either way, she's found dead, and there's even theories that Hitler might have shot her. Hitler falls into a depression. His photographer introduces him to someone who works in the photographer's studio named Eva Braun. And when Geri Robbel, Hitler's niece, kills herself, Eva Braun looks a lot like Geri Robbel. Somehow it seems to work. Hitler comes out of the depression. Eva Braun wants to marry Hitler. Hitler chooses to keep her rather as a shadow mistress. Nonetheless, it was during this period where Geri Robbel, his niece, just killed herself, that he met Hindenburg. And Hindenburg originally had a very, very negative view on Adolf Hitler. But members of Hindenburg's government are going to now convince Hindenburg to actually give Hitler some power and actually even make him chancellor, because they felt that Hitler might be useful in their goal of defeating the communists, and they underestimate Hitler.
leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power, we'll get to keep our power, and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet." What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents.
Okay, so Parliament building burns down, and quickly a young Dutch communist is arrested. Now, this individual had a history of arson. He even threatened to burn Parliament down. Today, a lot of historians believe that he simply didn't have the capability of doing it. And some people believe that the Nazis actually burned Parliament down, blamed it on the communists, and then used this for Hitler to introduce a state of emergency and convince Paul von Hindenburg to enable him to pass this enabling law. And Hindenburg at this point in time is very, very old, and his wits are not there with him. So Hitler was able to, in his position as chancellor, exercise a lot of influence over the aging Hindenburg. And when you have the crisis that Parliament building burns down, the Parliament met at a nearby opera house. Hitler's brown shirts would surround the building, make it very, very difficult for opposition to meet in this building when Hitler passed this enabling law.
Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to Parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a...
The law was passed for 4 years, but since he had basically unlimited power, he would just renew the law after 4 years.
Dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced,
So in 1934, they killed any opposition to Hitler.
pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted, and eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as